A warm welcome now to our next guest, Greg Wilson, Senior Advisor to Our Republican Legacy. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Financial Policy under President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush. Greg, welcome to the Business Briefing.
Janet, good morning, and thank you for having me.
Greg, I'm so happy to have you on the show today. As you might have seen the headline that President Trump is paying a personal visit today to the Federal Reserve building. And we were joking earlier that everyone is sure to be there with, their starched shirts, standing in attention for the president's visit. There's this big debate raging right now about the administration's opposition to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's current policy stance, their desire to perhaps replace him perhaps sooner rather than later. Tell us why this is of concern to you.
Sure, I appreciate that. And let me put the sideshow of the president's visit today aside for a moment. And let me do this, Janet. Let me briefly set the stage as I see it. I will share our Republican Legacy's perspectives and then make three quick points to conclude. First, just to set the stage, from my perspective, we truly are at a critical inflection point in our history. We need to be concerned about the nation's economy and our economic security, our national security, the geopolitical risks that arise from both the hot wars in Europe and other conflicts, and that includes the global trade war that President Trump has set off with his so-called beautiful tariffs that he unleashed earlier this year without any congressional authorization. So with that as background, ORL's position is that our economy has benefited over the long term by having an independent Federal Reserve dedicated to promoting price stability and maximum employment. Anything that undermines that independence and consequently harms our financial markets and economy, particularly the competitiveness of our markets and our economy, it's a bad idea. It's just a really bad idea. Former Federal Reserve chairs Bernanke and Yellen said in an op-ed this week that the Fed's credibility is a national asset, and I firmly believe that. And what the President Trump objects to is the recent statements by Federal Reserve Chairman Powell before Congress talking about the uncertainty of the inflationary impact of his tariffs. And so the Fed has a legitimate concern, but as we all know, the President doesn't like criticism. And history teaches us that the central bank, any moves to undermine a central bank by the executive branch, especially in authoritarian countries, only harm in a country. And what typically happens, and I saw this firsthand when I was working after my government service in both Venezuela and Argentina, is that you have the debasement of the currency, hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and general economic chaos. And so that's why we can't afford any encroachment on the independence of the Federal Reserve. Last three quick points. First, anything the president might do to fire Chairman Powell or undermine Federal Reserve's independence would be illegal. And just another example of the president trying to undermine the rule of law, and it violates one of our principles at our Republican Legacy. Second, as I mentioned just a minute ago, it would be destabilizing and shaking financial markets unnecessarily. Even the childish insults, the ongoing noise from his trip over to the White House, his concern with the overruns, which have nothing to do with monetary policy. It just undermines global confidence, creates more unnecessary market uncertainty, and just one more factor that would dissuade businesses from, investing here in our economy. And finally, it just betrays a longstanding Republican principle about sound money, price stability, and responsible economic policies, and just it goes against the grain of our belief in what's required for both fiscal and monetary policy stability to promote, economic growth and more economic opportunity.
Greg, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned, which I'm glad you brought up, is that there have been a lot of case studies and real world examples like the ones you cite from your experience in Argentina and elsewhere. But in particular, there was some seminal economic research done in the 1990s. I think it was an economist by the last name of Summers, if I'm not mistaken, that did in fact indicate what you're suggesting, that economies in which the central bank has less independence or is not fully independent tend to underperform. They tend to have higher inflation over the long term because even as they seek to bring short-term rates lower, it ends up pushing long-term rates higher. Tell us about this research. Are you familiar with it, and how concerned are you about the likelihood of this becoming an eventuality in our country?
I'm not familiar with that particular research. I'm not a trained economist, but the general point applies. And again, I think if you go back and look at the op-ed from Chairman Bernanke and Yellen, who are trained economists, they make the same point. And, investors, worry about the politicization of the central bank. They just anticipate that they're going to, force lower interest rates. President Trump himself has said he would like to get our interest rates down to 1%. That'd be nice in an ideal world under, ideal conditions. It's not where we are today. It's not how the Fed operates. So nice to have, but not realistic. And investors, are going to anticipate that if it's going to get political, we're going to demand more to buy government securities and finance our debt.
All right, let's talk about, Fed independence, because we've been discussing about why it matters. And I think that there are some in the administration who argue, hey, it's not that we don't want the Fed to be independent. It's that we think the Fed should be working more closely with the Treasury, because certainly Scott Bessent and Kevin Warsh and others have been talking about reforms that they'd like to see to how the Fed operates. They'd like to see the Fed work more closely with the Treasury. I guess first, describe to us what you've been hearing from the administration about the so-called reforms that they'd like to institute. But second, your response to what those reforms would mean. Would they really endanger Fed independence?
Well, I haven't talked with anybody in the administration about their reforms. The concept about stepping back, after the Fed was created in 1913 and assessing, its role in our economy today is one I subscribe to, done correctly, right, and in a very methodical, fact-based, independent way. Do we need a dual mandate? Should the Federal Reserve still be in the position of being a bank regulator? There are a lot of legitimate issues that Congress in particular, since, the Fed is a creature of the Congress, ought to be looking at. And having served on the old House Banking Committee in my first years in Washington, I would have full faith and confidence in my another former Treasury colleague, Chairman French Hill of Arkansas, to conduct a year-long worth of hearings, looking at potential Federal Reserve forms and any changes that might be needed to the Federal Reserve Act, which in my tenure in the last 40 years, does get amended on a regular basis. So the concept of a broad review of Fed policy makes a lot of sense. Having said that, I will tell you, at least when I was at the Treasury Department back in the late 80s, we had very good lines of communication with the Federal Reserve at my levels, lower down, at the up to the level of the Secretary. Used to talk frequently with the Chairman of the Fed. We would meet with governors and have regular weekly lunch meetings with Fed and senior Fed staff to talk about current issues that were of mutual concern to both the central bank and the Treasury Department.
All right, let's talk about some of the response we're hearing from those who already kind of are coming out in support of what the president and the administration are saying. You think that checks and balances sort of already exist and that they don't need to have any additional checks and balances on the Fed. Tell us what you mean by that, because what I'm hearing from those who sort of support the administration's position is that checks and balances are direly needed. Why do you think that's not the case?
So I didn't mean to imply there weren't checks and balances. I certainly think there are. So as a matter of law, for example, the Federal Reserve the Chairman of the Federal Reserve appears before both the authorizing committees in the House and Senate. Again, my old committee now, House Financial Services, Senate Banking in the Senate, to report on the conduct of monetary policy, and then they get into any other Fed-related issue or not, including things like trade and tariffs, and interest rates that the Congress wants to raise. Bills are introduced all the time dealing with the Federal Reserve and its role as a central bank regulator. They get considered by Congress. Chairman Hill is free to call up Chairman Powell at any given time to testify on any given issue. So I truly believe that checks and balances exist. That said, beyond the presidential appointment of the Board of Governors, There is no any other executive sway over the Federal Reserve, and I believe that's a correct posture.
If we were to see, hypothetically, Jerome Powell be removed before the end of his tenure, what do you think the market reaction would be?
It would be chaos, in my humble opinion. Lots of negative effects that I think you would see. I think you would see the bond markets go crazy. Investors would be concerned. It would depend on who, the president had in mind to put in place. That person would have to have a variety of characteristics and credibility and capabilities that he or she would have to bring to bear. But I think it would be unnecessarily destabilizing and not a good thing for our economy long term, and would just do away with trust that people have in the central bank to do the right thing over the long term, and resist political pressures.
Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about Our Republican Legacy, what you do there, where we can learn more.
So Our Republican Legacy is a nonprofit that was founded in 2024 by former Republican Senators Jack Danforth, William Cohen, and the late Alan Simpson, along with dozens of other former Republican members of Congress and elected officials, to really reimagine and try to remake the Republican Party so we, as in we the people, can achieve a better future for our children and grandchildren. We're organized around 5 founding principles of unity, the Constitution, fiscal responsibility, we've just been talking about a little bit, free enterprise, and peace through strength. And that guides our advocacy on current public issues, and you'll find more of our statements at ourrepublicanlegacy.com.
That's Greg Wilson, Senior Advisor to Our Republican Legacy. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Financial Policy under President Reagan and President H.W. Bush.